Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Come on in and take your virtual seat. I'm gonna stall for a second here while people cycle in and pop in through the Zoom interface. My name is John Bracken. I have the pleasure to be the Executive Director of the Digital Public Library of America and to welcome you all here to this latest DPLA book talk. You'll hear more about DPLA later in the program, but just to give you what the Digital Public Library of America is, a less than 10-year-old project and effort to ensure that the work that libraries and museums and cultural memory institutions not only survive in a digital context, but really thrive. And we seek to bridge larger conversations happening today about the state of American democracy in a digital context and how our institutions and practices can and should be part of those dialogues and part of that progress of building a true American democracy. Earlier this year, we started as an experiment what we call DPLA Book Talks. This is the latest iteration of that with Adam. We're so excited to have Adam Harris here from the Atlantic. And this is the first one we're doing as a collaboration with one of our partners. So Adam Bush is here from College Unbound, and we're really excited to welcome an organization that we've been in solidarity and in admiration of for a long time and have some similar roots and desires. Before I hand it over to my colleague, Shanae Yvette Moraine, to really set the table, I want to put a flag in the ground around why this topic is so important to DPLA. I think too often when we talk about structures of oppression and white supremacy, often in our field, it can become a historical conversation. And I think part of the urgency of Adam's work and the dialogue that his book has helped provoke in our community and in our organization is that there's not a historical element, right? The impacts of white supremacy and legacies of oppression are experienced a day-to-day basis. They're real work, they're real things that that are impacting American society. And in particular, selfishly, as an organization that grew out of a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that we grew out of Harvard, and that historically has been very most comfortable in partnering and working with white dominant institutions and white-led higher institution education institutions. I think it's particularly incumbent upon us as an organization, and it's certainly a conversation we've been having as a staff, as a board, and with our larger community, to be very intentional about what it means to put ourselves in solidarity, to own history and legacies of practice that we need to root out and move us into a practice of liberation and success and true democracy. And so, Adam, thank you so much for being part of this with us. Thank you for your work. It's helped ground a lot of our conversations in a much more cogent way than it would have otherwise. And now I'm going to turn it over to DPLA's Director of Community Engagement, Shanae Moraine, who also, as an added feature, and I don't think this is part of your introduction, Shanae, but she provoked this conversation. You brought this work to the table. So thank you for bringing this conversation like you have with so many others to the table. And welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, John. Just as an introduction to DPLA for some of our new attendees, DPLA is a national network of 4,000 plus state and regional digital libraries that design technology and build diverse collections and make them freely accessible to the public to find in a single access point at dp.la. I have the great privilege of introducing our featured author and speakers this afternoon for a conversation about the dirty open secret of America's colleges and universities, which is that they have never been given Black people a fair chance to succeed. From its inception, our higher education system was not built on equality or accessibility, but on educating and prioritizing white students. And that is a direct quote from Adam Harris's book. As I shared before we started, I've been fortunate to follow Adam on Twitter since 2015. So inviting him to dive into this work chronicling racial inequality in higher education and solutions to help solve the underfunding of historically Black colleges and universities today during homecoming season while students at Howard University are protesting against housing conditions and lack of student representation on the school's board of trustees, it really feels like we're having the right conversation at the right time. I want to give much love and solidarity to the students at Howard, HBCUs across the country, and a special shout out to Mr. Harris's alumna undergraduate alma mater, Alabama A&M University, the great Bethune-Cookman University. Thank you again, Adam, for being with us to talk about your new book. Adam Harris is a staff writer at The Atlantic, covering national politics, and he is also a national fellow at New America. He is the author of the book we're exploring today, The State Must Provide, a narrative history of racial inequality in higher education, published by Echo, an imprint of HarperCollins. He was previously a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he covered federal education policy and historically Black colleges and universities. In 2021, this year, he was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. His writing has appeared in the BBC, Bleacher Report, and Ebony Magazine. Dr. Marcia Walker-McWilliams will be moderating this conversation and is one of 4 new DPLA board members. Dr. Walker-McWilliams is Executive Director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, providing strategic leadership and operational management for the BMRC's activities, and work with members of the community and BMRC institutions to facilitate the discovery, preservation, and use of Black historical collections. We'll also hear from DPLA conversation partner Adam Bush, the co-founder and provost of College Unbound, a degree completion college working both inside and outside of carceral spaces of Rhode Island to ensure all adult learners are valued as scholar practitioners and have access to a bachelor's degree pathway. This is going to be so good. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Walker-McWilliams, some Zoom housekeeping. We ask that you ask your questions in the Q&A box at the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will monitor the chat, and speakers will answer questions in the end and incorporate them into their responses. And now for our book talk on The State Must Provide. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And so before we jump into the conversation, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the book, where it came from, and you know, as Shanae mentioned, as John mentioned, kind of why in this moment this work felt necessary. So to kind of go back to where the book came from, you know, when I was in high school, I visited a number of institutions, everywhere from Cornell University and Ithaca to Trinity in San Antonio to Lon Morris College out in Jacksonville, Texas. And, I was able to see those sort of differences in terms of the institutional resources that they had across the country. But there were a select group of institutions that always felt like home to me and felt like the places that I was probably going to end up. There was, Alabama State University where my dad went, or Alabama A&M where my sister was and where my mom had gone to college. And then there was Hampton University in Virginia where my other sister went to college. Ultimately, I ended up at Alabama A&M University. And, when you're a student at an institution, the first couple of weeks, it's a brand new place and you're really excited about it. And I really had a great experience with my professors and I got to know them, and they kind of welcomed me into the community really quickly. But after a couple of weeks, you start to, your homework starts to pile up and you start to get the additional assignments. And I found myself feeling really busy and I needed a bit of a release. I needed to change my location so I could get some work done. And so there was a library across campus, across town, about 10 minutes away at the University of Alabama at Huntsville. Their hours were about 3 hours longer than ours. And so I figured it would be a good place to go. When I got over to UAH, it was a little bit shocking what I saw, because in terms of the institutional resources that they had versus what my own institution in Alabama A&M University, a historically Black college, had. And not only that, Alabama A&M had been open for 75 years longer than UAH. And so, I figured that they would have more resources, more greater endowment, and the ability to sort of fund those infrastructure projects that may have been deferred. But there's also this idea that perhaps I was being melodramatic, right? I'm a student on campus, and everyone kind of typically, you're able to point out the flaws at home more than you are elsewhere. The grass always sort of seems greener on the other side. But there were two questions that really emerged from what I noticed that day when I moved over and went over to the University of Alabama, Huntsville. It was one, why was there such a sort of financial difference where they were able to afford new buildings between that campus and my own? And was my experience an anomaly, or was that the norm for students like me? Knowingly or unknowingly, I took those questions along with me when I began covering higher education at the Chronicle. Where, as I mentioned, I covered federal education policy and historically Black colleges and universities. And the more I learned of the federal government's role in education, the more it sort of stuck with me, well, if the government was playing such a large role in higher education, why is there such difference between, institutions that were created to serve Black students when other institutions were not doing so, and predominantly white colleges? And at the end of my time at the Chronicle, as I was coming towards the end, I worked on a story that dealt with Mississippi's historically Black colleges, the longest running case to understand what it means for a state to desegregate its higher education system came out of the state of Mississippi. It's known as the Ayers Settlement. And in the Ayers Settlement, after nearly 30 years, the Black colleges and the students that they served received over $500 million split across 17 years between their 3 HBCUs to eliminate the vestiges of segregation in their higher education system. But when I went down to Mississippi, it was quite clear that a lot of those vestiges remained, and even some of the things that settlement was supposed to address, including the drainage systems at Mississippi Valley State University, a historically Black college, was still woefully inadequate. And so as I was poking into this story, another thing that I learned was that there were still 6 states that hadn't proven to the federal government that they had eliminated those vestiges of segregation in their higher education system. And so knowing all of that, I thought that it was the right time to really set out and understand the role that the federal and state actors had played in creating, fostering and maintaining and defending this inequitable system that was not just an anomaly that I recognized, but that it was truly a fact that higher education had a dirty open secret, and that was that they had never given Black students an equal chance to succeed. And so the book traces that legacy from the foundations of the state higher education system as we recognize it today up until the current day, and addresses some of the solutions for what to do with that knowledge. And before we jump into the conversation, I'll just outline some of that history. And so, going back to the 1850s, late 1850s, early 1860s, there was a national conversation going on about ways to train workers, right? There were places to teach people the art of manslaying, their words, not mine. There were places to teach people to be lawyers and doctors, but there weren't places to train teachers. There weren't places to train agricultural workers. And so there was a thought to create a system of colleges, agricultural and mechanical institutions that would do that would teach the arts and the sciences and the maths and the things that workers needed to know. And so in 1862, Congress signs a bill known as the Morrill Act, which gives states lands that they are able to sell in order to fund, sell or use to fund an institution of higher education. But the issue was that these institutions were often only attended by white students. And you fast forward to 1890, one of the first states to accept that land grant in 1862 was Iowa. And Iowa State University, the institution that would become Iowa State University, is funded with that land grant. By 1890, Iowa State University had not enrolled a Black student. In 1890, it's another significant date. It's one that people often point to as the date that the federal government began funding historically Black colleges and universities. But in reality, that second bill that was passed in 1890 was not to create a separate class of institutions for Black students, but it was to better fund those predominantly white institutions, those white institutions that had been created out of that original Morrill Act. And so you start to see where a wealth stratification begins to happen in higher education. There are, of course, state examples where a state like Mississippi was giving a place like Alcorn State a guaranteed appropriation of $50,000 a year for a decade starting in 1871. But when the political class of Mississippi changed in 1875, that appropriation was reduced to $15,000, and then the next year it was reduced again to $5,500. Meanwhile, a place like University of Mississippi is receiving lush state funding. But you fast forward from that basis, from that unequal foundation, as some institutions are allowed to grow and flourish. And states are actually studying along this time all of the ways that they are underfunding their institutions. In Kentucky, in the early 1900s, they brought a professor down to study what would become Kentucky State and say, what would it take to make this institution like a Tuskegee University or even a Hampton Institute? And ultimately, the professor comes down and he says, well, your girls' dorm is fire prone, it lacks fire escapes. Your boys' dorm, your men's dormitory is in a mud puddle. Your electrical plant doesn't have power. Your buildings are old, your faculty are underpaid. And it would be a significant investment in order to bring this institution up to standard. And yet that investment was never made. The state said that they had $40,000, which they could fix all of these issues with. You fast forward to the 1940s, and Kentucky is funding Black students and white students at a 42-to-1 ratio in terms of $42 for every white student compared to $1 for every Black student. And so you see that wealth disparity created, and it was never fully addressed. You get programs like affirmative action, which entered into the federal lexicon in the 1960s, but was effectively blunted as a tool for remedy for a legacy of systemic discrimination within less than 2 decades. And then you still have today, and then this is going to be my last point, you still have today a system where 6 states have not proven that they've desegregated their higher education system to the federal government. And several of the states that still have deep and ongoing issues with their funding to historically Black colleges and the students that attend them. On top of that, there is a wealth disparity in terms of the types of institutions that Black students attend compared to white students. In a place like North Carolina, if you're attending a public college and you're a Black student, 22% of Black students in North Carolina attend one of the 12 predominantly white public institutions, including UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina State University, and the like. 25% attend the 5 historically Black colleges, and 52% attend the state's community colleges. And yet UNC and North Carolina State are funded at levels that are astronomical in comparison to those other institutions. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage for understanding why there's a financial difference, and understanding that the experience of these institutions, even though they have their individual stories, they have kind of as a group experienced this sort of systemic discrimination that continues into the present day. And I look forward to discussing more about the book and all of the granular details of how that discrimination manifested itself, and that it didn't just appear that our higher education system was unequal, but that it was in a lot of ways intentionally created that way and defended to be as unequal as it is today.
Thank you so much, Adam, for really distilling some of the most important arguments from your book into that summary. And I'm excited to get into the Q&A as well. I just want to make a brief reminder for everyone attending. Please submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to those. So first, Adam, I just want to thank you for writing this book. As someone who spent their entire professional career in higher ed, starting off as a student at PWIs or predominantly white institutions, and then being on the faculty at Hispanic serving institution and HBCU and PWIs as well. There were so many times in reading your book that I was like, yes, yes. Yes, I mean, I think I even got some amens that I wrote in the margins. And one of the quotes that I picked up from your book that just really stood out to me was you say, discrimination is a contortionist, bending and twisting until it fits within the confines of the system it is given. And one of the themes that really sort of permeates the text throughout is that this was by design, right? That there were laws at the state level, at the federal level, and that there were policies and practices that made discrimination and segregation and this inequity kind of baked into institutions. And so I was wondering if you could just talk more about the sort of role of law in really playing a role in terms of how our higher education institutions were unequal from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to explain that one of the institutions that I use that is actually kind of carries as a thread throughout the book is Berea College, because and Berea plays two sorts does sort of two jobs in the book, and the first is that there's often this thought that people can only be judged by the environment that they were living in, right? That they can be judged by the standards of their time. But Berea was a place in the South in the 1850s that was trying interracial education. It was a place that was built on this idea that God have made of one blood all the people of the earth, that they were going to actively, be coeducational, be interracial, and teach people the arts and sciences, but also teach people to live and work together. And that mission, right, and it survived the Civil War. It survived their founder being run out of town. It survived Plessy v. Ferguson. But I think, by the end of the 1880s, early 1890s, it was roughly a 50-50 institution between Black students and white students. But that was only undone by state policy, by a lawmaker who literally one of the first and only bills that he was able to pass before he died was a bill that was banning even private institutions from educating Black students and white students together. He instituted a severe penalty for teachers called teaching a class, a daily fine. He said that you couldn't operate, the same college could not operate a campus within 25 miles of each other. So you really start to see the perniciousness and how, really pernicious these laws were. But you also see, the ways that, from 1740, this has historically been the trend, right? You legislate this sort of, they legislated inequality for education. They barred enslaved people from reading. Enslaved people couldn't even read the Bible at some points. But you fast forward, and it's not only written into the laws, but it ends up getting written into court documents to say that, we have just come out of more than, in a place like Alabama, they instituted their law that segregated education in 1901. But by 1978, they're saying, well, it's none of these people's fault that, Black students aren't able to get into an institution like the University of Alabama, or it's not their fault that, Auburn University remains as segregated as it is, an institution where in 1985 was declared the most segregated institution in the state of Alabama at 2 or 3% Black students. And even today, it still has just roughly 5% Black students. And so I think broadly, you see how law and the courts really shaped a lot of the a lot of the inequality that we see today. I think the last point is, as you mentioned, kind of discrimination as a contortionist. One of the things that I thought a lot about during this book, and as I was researching the book, was, A. Louise Sipple Fisher's case, George McLaurin's case, and the way that as the courts maybe broke down one barrier, saying, okay, well, you have to create at least a separate institution for Black students. Oklahoma rushes a law school into existence in 5 days. They say, well, that's not an equal institution. You have to enroll them in school with white students. And then they're like, well, okay, we're going to put George McLaurin out in the hallway. Well, you have to put him in the class. Okay, we're going to put him in the class, but we're going to put a bar in the class to ensure that the classroom is segregated. And so you just see all of the ways and the granular details of how they decided. And at each step, they really worked to maintain this veneer of segregation. And as as the law morphed, the discrimination really morphed with it.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the cases that you just mentioned, because for most Americans, we're thinking about kind of the history of education and racism and desegregation. Many people's minds will go automatically to Brown v. Board of Ed in 1954. And that is the kind of lexicon, moment. But one of the things that you do is that you actually say, no, there are these precursor cases that are happening really around higher education that are just as important to understand and notice. And I just want to give you a shout out, because it is not easy to make legal history jump off the page. But you did a great job kind of building in more, I would say, a more humane element into the legal cases. So can you talk more about some of those precursors to Brown?
Yeah. So I focus on three primary cases: the Gaines case versus the University of Missouri, Ada Louise Sipple Fisher versus the University of Oklahoma, and George McLaurin versus the University of Oklahoma. And as you mentioned, right, these were the precursor cases to Brown v. Board of Education. And really what they were trying to do, the sort of legal strategy that had been devised, was to really say, okay, at a very root level, states need to provide a separate education for Black students. The states at that time had been practicing the scheme of basically sending Black students out of state in order to get graduate education if they could not offer it in state. In the case of Kentucky, right, they one year when they decided to do this, they said, okay, we're going to allot $5,000 to send Black students out of state. They, of course, did not get to that $5,000 number, but that same year they reduced Kentucky State University's annual appropriation by $5,000. But I think one of the things I really wanted to dig into with these cases was the ways that states, when told that they needed to provide at least a separate education for Black students, even failed to do that. If you're going to live up to, the courts were effectively saying, if you're going to live up to the idea of Plessy v. Ferguson that separate can be equal, then you need to at least have this separate option. And so the first case that I dig into is the Gaines case in the 1930s. And Lloyd Gaines was from Water Valley, Mississippi, moved up to Missouri with his family, and he wanted to become a lawyer. There was not a place for him to study law in the state, but he wanted to practice law in his home state, right? And it would have been a burden, an unnecessary burden, to go out of state to practice law. And so he applies to the University of Missouri's law school, is of course rejected. And over the next couple of years is back and forth in court battles. Ultimately, the case works its way up to the Supreme Court, and the University of Missouri is told, or the state is told, that you have to create this separate institution for him. And the tragedy of Lloyd Gaines is that chapter is actually titled, is that he ultimately ends up he goes missing. No, it's not necessarily known what exactly happened to him, but he writes a letter to his mom, and you talked about kind of the making legal history kind of personal. The reason why I wanted to tell these stories so personally, and not write about the oh, well, this court case happened and then they did this thing in the trial, but really dig into these people's stories, is because what you understand is they did not want things that were too different than what students want now. He wanted to get a legal education. He just wanted to be provided with a legal education, and had the not only be provided with one, but had the credentials to do so. But he writes this letter to his mom after fighting for years in court, where he says, sometimes I wish that I was just a man not a man whose name everyone knew, not a man who was fighting for a cause, but just a man. And it really, it really points to the toll that took on these people and their families, right? On Lloyd Gaines, on Ada Louise Sippel Fisher, because these were not easy battles. These were long fights that took years and years out of their lives, all for the sake of trying to get what was and should have been guaranteed by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
Absolutely, yes. The kind of human toll and the burden that it took on these individuals to wage these fights is definitely really powerful. We have a couple of questions that have come in, so I want to turn to those. And again, thinking about burdens, one of the questions is, can you speak about the student loan debt crisis and its effect on Black students and federal funding for public institutions and HBCUs?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, as you know, Black students are more likely to take on student debt. They're more likely to take on more student debt. They're more likely to default on that debt after leaving college. And understanding that effectively higher education has become a required credential for most, well-paying jobs at this point. Knowing that it's almost like the student debt conversation is really a racial justice issue. And so as far as it concerns kind of funding for historically Black colleges, when they are not able to access the same sort of state funding, federal funding, they don't have that legacy of philanthropic giving, right? 2020, of course, was a record year in philanthropic giving for HBCUs, but that only, affected us maybe like 25, 26 HBCUs, and it doesn't account for all of those years where, there were no HBCUs in the top 100, 200 of philanthropic gifts. And so, but without those sort of institutional resources, the cost of paying for an education gets shuttled off to the student more often, right? At a place like Harvard, a place like Brown, a place like Georgetown, oftentimes low-income students are going to pay little to no money to attend that institution because of the robust financial aid packages that they're able to offer. But that's often not the case for a lot of these institutions. And so they may end up going into debt, or their parents may end up going into debt in order to fund their education. And so, one of the reasons why a lot of the political candidates, the presidential candidates in this last cycle wrapped in historically Black colleges into their free college plans, into their tuition or debt-free college plans, was one, as a signal to say that we understand the work that these institutions have done, but also as a way to say this is a way to help those students who are going to attend these institutions. Something like 62, 63% of students who attend historically Black colleges are Pell eligible, so are eligible for grants for low-income students. And so, just to get back to the question about student debt, right? It makes that debt cancellation issue, it makes the free college issue really a racial justice issue. And I think until we understand the student debt question as a crisis that is largely unevenly felt, it'll still kind of be a surface level conversation and won't have the depth that's necessary to address it.
Absolutely. And there's a similar question for you, Adam. Can you talk about the stakes for HBCUs and Black students as Congress debates the Build Back Better bill?
Yes. So originally in the Build Back Better bill, or in the infrastructure bill, there was a significant amount of money, I think something like $45 billion that would have been allocated to HBCUs, and that has been significantly reduced as negotiations and as things have been trimmed from something like 3.5 trillion to trying to get down to that 1.75 trillion number. And I think for historically Black colleges, right now they are standing to, I think negotiations have it around $3 billion for the institutions in the bill that will be in kind of competitive grants that the institutions will have to apply for. But I think that it really gets back to this idea and this reality that the scale of the harm, we haven't really seen something that actually gets to the scale of the harm. If you're looking at just a state like like Maryland, which recently settled with its Black colleges for $577 million over 10 years split between the 4 HBCUs, a expert witness in that case said that it would be at least $2.73 billion to atone for the financial damages that had been done to these institutions. And so if those 4 institutions themselves, need at least $2.73 billion, and there's a $3 billion pot for, all 100 HBCUs, you really start to see that that's going to get nickel and dimed. And so it's not really on the scale that's necessary for redress. And the last thing, Denise Smith at the Century Foundation recently released a report that talks about HBCU endowments. The average HBCU endowment is several times less than what the typical predominantly white institution's endowment is. And so she proposed an endowment fund of roughly $40 billion so that the institutions are able to plan for the future. That's one thing endowments allow you to do is think and plan for the future. Say that, if we have a nice enough return this year, then we can, do this infrastructure project over here, and your budget doesn't end up being so slim year to year.
Absolutely. And I think one of the statistics you had in the book was that the average HBCU endowment is around 12 million. And that pales in comparison to the average, I think, for colleges was 65 million. But, there are a number of institutions across the country where they're into the billions in terms of their endowments. And that was one of the things that you had brought up in the book in terms of solutions as to how we might begin to sort of really address, as you say, the scale of harm. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the solutions that you posed in the book as to how we can really start to, one, reckon with the inequity that has happened, and 2, start to repair that, right, in ways that really match the scale of the harm.
Yeah, and I think, as I put a lot of onus on state and federal government because it was the laws and the environment that the laws were able to foster in order to sort of provide some of that repair and that sort of reparation for the harm. But I also think that there's a role for, predominantly white institutions, those that benefited from slavery and segregation, to play in helping the institutions that were serving Black students when they would not, right? So in 1831, I mentioned this in the book, Simeon Jocelyn, an abolitionist in New Haven, Connecticut, effectively went to a town council meeting with a plan to start a college for African-American students. And it almost literally led to a riot in town. The plan was shot down in 3 days. It led to prolonged violence in New Haven. And it was effectively, white people in New Haven saying that we have Yale, we don't want to have a sort of equal education for Black students in our town. If you look at a place like the University of Mississippi, right, and just after the Civil War, white parents were afraid that their children would be going to school with Black students when the University of Mississippi reopened. And so the faculty at the university wrote a letter to the newspaper and said, we would all rather resign and this institution close than enroll a Black student. Meanwhile, Alcorn State, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, was having its appropriations slashed from a guaranteed $50,000 a year for a decade to $15,000 to $5,500. And so what does a place like the University of Mississippi, which was saying it would rather close and enroll a Black student, and a place like Alcorn State University, which was trying to educate Black students with fewer and fewer resources, what does Mississippi owe to Alcorn State? What is a place like Georgetown, which sold 272 people in order to keep its university alive? The reason why the institution is still here today, in large part, is because of the sale of those 272 people. What does it owe to the places that may have educated the descendants of those people when that institution was not? Yes, they've created a scholarship fund now, but that doesn't repair for that harm that was done across generations. And so I do think that the institutions that are wealthy and well off, there are places that made billions and billions of dollars just on returns on their endowment investments this year. Washington University of St. Louis roughly doubled their endowment this year on the returns on their investment into, I think, the 13, 14, $15 billion range. And so I just think there's something that Dr. Ruth Simmons told me a couple of years ago when I asked her about why she undertook the project when she was the president of Brown University to study the university's relationship with slavery. And she told me that, universities have a responsibility to tell the truth. And if they don't, they become another corrupt institution, just like any other institution that deserves scrutiny and deserves what it gets. But within that, there's sort of the next step after, they tell the truth about their history, and that's that making repair for that history. If the University of Virginia, if Thomas Jefferson could not have imagined a University of Virginia without slavery at its core, what does an institution that is professing to those sort of higher ideals that he would write about, but that didn't always practice, what does that university now owe if it hopes to live up to those higher ideals?
Absolutely. And it's wonderful you mentioned Ruth Simmons and the work that she did at Brown. And just a caveat, we can certainly get back to other questions, is that I was an undergraduate student at that time and was at Brown that summer through a Leadership Alliance program. And I was working with one of the key professors, James Campbell, who was a part of Brown's Slavery Commission on Race. And my project that summer was doing some research into historical records in the area about the university's relationship to slavery and the slave trade, and then also thinking about the reparations debate. And I was in that Leadership Alliance with students from HBCUs who I lived with, me being from a predominantly white institution. And the whole summer we were having conversations about the differences of experiences of Black students at PWIs versus HBCUs. And over again, the HBCU students were, it's about the resources. It's about what we can get in terms of, the journals, the amenities, the buildings on campus, and all of those things. So it's really just kind of coming full circle. And now thinking about Ruth Simmons, who is the president of Prairie View A&M University, and some of the inroads that she is trying to make there in terms of bringing more funding to the institution. I'm wondering if you can just talk more about this kind of moment for HBCUs. Because on the one hand, we're in this moment, like you mentioned earlier, of increased philanthropy, but we are also in a moment where folks are pushing back heavily against anything related to discussing race and racism in American history, right? We've got the anti-critical race theory folks. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about this particular moment and where we sit in terms of our reality thinking about race in higher ed.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about, the idea of publishing a book like this that is examining the ways that racism and structural discrimination were baked into the beginning of an institution, and that they've continued on into the present day, and that pushback, like you're saying, against kind of that sort of history and that really kind of critical examination of American institutions. But as you also mentioned, right, HBCUs are experiencing what can likely be referred to as a renaissance of attention, right? They have been in the spotlight rather prominently for the last several months, if not years, right? Since, maybe even since the beginning of the Trump administration, for all of the criticism of the photo opportunity in the Oval Office during the Trump administration, HBCUs have really faced a renaissance of attention since that, since that February meeting. And so I think there have been historically these sort of peaks and valleys in terms of the attention and funding that the institutions have received, right? There was a large philanthropic push for HBCUs from, Northern white philanthropists, the American Missionary Association, from, the 1870s to the 1890s when it waned. And so I think the institutions at this moment are really trying to seize upon the kind of the energy and the understanding around that legacy of discrimination, to say that, one, we need repair for the past, but also understand that what we're still doing in this moment. Understand that despite all of that, and in spite of this centuries of underfunding, a place like North Carolina A&T can be the third highest public research producing institutions in the state of North Carolina. And it's doing that in spite of, just less than 2 decades ago, when North Carolina A&T, I should back up, I kind of skipped a step there. about 2 decades ago, when North Carolina A&T made the jump to become a high research producing activity institution, they weren't given any additional money by the state. They were, given a pat on the back. Good job, you guys did it. 2 predominantly white institutions did the same thing, just about 2 and 3 years later, respectively. And each of those institutions received $10 million to make that jump. North Carolina A&T is still fighting to this day to try to get that money that they were denied. They received 2.5 million of it, and they're back at the legislature now trying to get the next 7.5. But you think of what the other institutions were able, just that 2 decades of being able to build on that $10 million. Rather than getting that $10 million now and having to try to build on it from this point, you still sort of see some of those inequities manifesting and repeating themselves. And until we address that legacy and then also kind of continue to fund the institutions at the levels which they are deserving of funding, we're going to kind of see these problems repeat.
Yes, it certainly comes across that this is not just about kind of historical wrongs, but like a wrong that is happening right now, right? Like as we speak, that this cycle and the ways in which these policies continue to negatively impact the institutions that serve most Black students, it's ongoing. So we do have a little bit of time for another question from the audience, if there is one. And while we're waiting, I'll just fill that with another one for you, Adam, is you conducted a lot of this research, using media and journalism, but also going into libraries and archives to look at institutional records. So I'm wondering if you can kind of say more about that journey, but then also what is the role for folks like myself who sit in libraries, archives, and cultural heritage organizations? How do we enter into this conversation? Is there a space for us to play a role in terms of, opening up the gaze onto higher education? Like what's possible for us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I did, honestly, shout out to archivists. I would not have been able to do this work without that. And also digital archives were incredibly helpful. A lot of this work, I had to slow down my process of actually going to different libraries when COVID hit, and so I had to use things like newspapers.com, and I had to use Berea College has a great digital archive that they digitized several of John Fee's letters, but I think really kind of one of the biggest things in terms of public imagination and the public being able to easily access these things is the digitization of the archives, and not only the digitization, but also kind of forming the collections that tell a story, right? I was able to view those letters that Lloyd Gaines sent to his mom and exchanged with his brother via the University of Missouri's digital archives. And Lincoln University's digital archives. And so I think kind of building these collections and doing some of that work of examining that history and making it accessible to people is incredibly important to a better understanding of the moment that we're currently in.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for indulging my questions and so diligently answering the questions from the audience. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Bush, who is the provost and co-founder of College Unbound, for some remarks.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Marcia. And Adam, it's really good to be here with you. Beyond remarks, actually, I have a couple more questions if I can keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
You do such a deft job of talking about inequitable higher education and its roots, and if so, then you're looking at inequitable citizenship and how well discrimination improvises and changes shape over time. And while it's tempting, I think, to position College Unbound as the newest accredited college in the country as something entirely new and different, it's really powerful through your work to also locate in this long lineage, not just of innovation, but of exclusion, of public disinvestment, of a maintenance and racial hierarchies in education. So I have a couple questions. I think we have enough time. I can maybe ask them in order. I'd say
Yeah.
we could go. Okay, cool. I mean, the first is it came out of a prompt that someone wrote in the chat too. Just you, and in your book you talk about it, but not yet in the comments necessarily, of this idea of land grant institutions and the Morrill Act, and of who and whom the land was grabbed from, and who is doing the granting, and to really unpack that notion of this like massive wealth transfer that was masquerading as donation. And if you could tease at that a little bit, and some of the current work done on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the land, this was land that was expropriated from Native Americans through lopsided treaties and violence, quite frankly, that expropriated from Native Americans and given to states from the federal government. Something, I think like 17 million acres of land that was doled out under the Morrill Act. $17 million worth of land that was doled out under the first Morrill Act. And it's interesting kind of positioning this in the idea of, okay, who was this innovation actually for? So they were creating these institutions, and they were offering these sort of lofty ideas about what they could do and how they would help the nation, right? When George Washington and Benjamin Rush and like all those guys were sitting in there with like powdered wigs and trying to understand in 1790 how to build a national character, right? They were pointing to universities as the places to do that, and they had actually figured that a national university would probably be best. And so the Morrill Act is actually one of it's the closest that the government ever came to actually realizing that, of saying, we're going to create a national system of universities where people can learn the arts and sciences and all of that good stuff, but also sort of the liberal arts, and then also learn how to be and also become better farmers effectively, also become better agricultural and mechanical workers. But I think understanding that root of who was this innovation actually for, and where did the resources for that innovation come from, are actually incredibly important to understanding the current moment. Because you say that the higher education system is the best in the world. It's like, well, how was that? How was it constructed? It was constructed, largely a place like Ohio State University, a place like West Virginia University, Auburn University, Oklahoma State University, Texas A&M University, the UC system, right? These are all land grant institutions that are built on land expropriated from Native Americans. And so what do those institutions owe to those tribes? What do those institutions, and then also, on the back end, what do those institutions owe to the people that they left out of their institution?
Yeah, your book's so well grounded in the reparations debate of this present moment. And that's about money investment, that's about admissions, it's about what is studied too, and what is taught at those spaces. And I was thinking about that in HBCUs. I also think about like San Francisco State University and those student strikes of the 60s in founding ethnic studies. And the hunger strikes for the Black Student Union and Third World Liberation Front were there to really push for the founding of the College of Ethnic Studies. The thing that they pushed for but didn't get was the challenging the meritocracy of changing admission standards. And I'm wondering too, and this touches on a lot of your writing that you've done in the Chronicle over the years also, of just if you could talk about or this notion of meritocracy in higher education, the role HBCUs play in sort of creating other models for being grounded in community, for and for creating different environments in higher education that then challenge the landscape as a whole.
Yeah, and a lot of highly selective institutions, they like to hold on to this idea of meritocracy because it makes their selectivity, and it's like that selectivity breeds prestige, and prestige breeds more selectivity, and the number of applicants goes up every year, and the number of students admitted stays the same. So they're like, oh well, this is the we have 3% acceptance rate this year, 4% acceptance rate this year, and how is that actually a good model for for a democracy, for an American project more broadly? Is that it's like in this idea that we've come to understand higher education as a private good rather than a public good, as it was understood in theory by the founders and understood in theory by the authors of the Morrill Act. It has sort of moved away from that understanding, even up until the point of the GI Bill. Like in theory, this was like an understanding of higher education as a public good. But as you mentioned, right, HBCUs, other institutions are providing an alternative model. They're saying that we can take just about any student and educate them and help them, help them climb the socioeconomic ladder, but also bring others with them. There's a great book, Shelter in the Time of Storm by Jelani Favors, that talks about the sort of second curriculum that students get at HBCUs. And it's art and science and math and communication, all that good stuff, but it's also an understanding of community, and understanding that it's not just about you, but it's about the whole. I often tell a story about, I'll tell this one really quickly. I guess this is my sophomore year. I was taking African American history at Alabama A&M, and I had just like aced this test, like just killed it, knocked it out of the park. This was like the second time that I had done really well on a test that not a lot of my classmates did very well on. And these were all of my friends, and I worked in the department at the time, and so I went and talked to the professor after, expecting kind of like a pat on the back, but she was like, "Hey, yeah, you did really well on the test, but why didn't you help any of your classmates study?" And it was like an understanding of, oh, this isn't just about me. This is, it's great if I'm doing well, but it's even better if we're all doing well. And I think that that sort of understanding of the community, understanding of the village is incredibly important in terms of moving forward as a democratic project, but then also is a good understanding for higher education more broadly.
I love that. I love that story you just told that stuff. And I have one more question. They just gave me the yellow light. So and there's so many in the audience right now that are staff in the co-founding community of College Unbound, because so much of what you're talking about in the history of institutionalization and the relationship to the state are all the things we're struggling with as a new college. So as a historian, I think you tell that story so well about the past, about how it informs the present and the movements and the organizing that's happening right now. I was wondering if you could put on your prognosticator glasses and the tarot cards, and what's coming down the line. Like, what are the next struggles in higher education? What are the next battles that we want to position ourselves for in founding new institutions, in organizing, so that we can together work for a more just world that really grounds a liberatory educational practice?
Yeah, I think that the next battle is actually the one that's kind of going on right now. It's around the debt that students are burdened with, right? People understand higher education. They understand colleges as a place that you're going to get this sort of necessary credential in order to get on to the sort of next job and to climb the ladder. I mean, oftentimes, in sort of conversation about the future of higher education, you think about things like retraining and the fact that people need to come back to school. And it's like, yes, I've gotten my degree in computer science, maybe, but if you're working in the field for 10 years, or maybe you're working in the field for 7 years and you went out on paternity leave and you thought, man, this paternity leave was great. And we're in a situation where I can afford to take off a little bit of time. So you're out of the workforce, but then you need to go back into the workforce. Something happens financially, you need to go back into the workforce, but you haven't received that training. Or is there sort of a sort of modular thing that you're able to do in order to receive that modular credential, so that you're able to have the sort of updated repertoire? So I think that a mix of debt and understanding kind of what college is for, if it is an inherently private thing that is only for that person to better themselves, then I think that you'll end up with a completely different version of college. But if we think of college as a public thing, something that it's K through 14 or K through 16, right, where you have a free college model that's either 2-year or 4-year, then then I think that that actually puts us in a very different place of, you know, we have more institutions that are more accessible to more people that at a lower cost. And I think that actually, you know, this may be the Atlantic in me talking, but I think as you know, we're in this sort of, if we're all in this democratic project together, and this, you know, small d democratic project together, then it's important for that sort of robust education and that sort of public facing, that place where people can one kind of learn to be good citizens and practice critical thinking. That just becomes all the more important.
Thanks for that, Adam. That was beautiful and awesome, and I'm all in. I want to thank the DPLA for bringing us together. I hope we meet in person soon, so I get my copy signed, and I want to pass it back to Shanae to wrap us up.
That was incredible. By far one of our best book talk conversations. Thank you, Dr. Walker-McWilliams, for coordinating. Thank you, Dr. Adam Bush, for your thoughtful questions and this phrase that I'm carrying with me at the end of this, that discrimination improvises. And I want to leave us off with a word that it's kind of mix of all three of you, but primarily with what Adam has shared, that libraries make accessible resources, document the truth of our nation's history, and that universities and our federal government have a responsibility to tell the truth about the harm they've done, pay what they owe, and live up, all of us together, to our espoused ideals. And those are words to walk and to live and to stand by. Thank you all for joining us for this book talk. Have a great afternoon. It's been a pleasure.